Greetings to you all who have joined us for this Surplus Trust policy dialogue today. Really, one might say, a high-powered panel, and we're almost truly global in our outreach today. We're looking at the Trump victory, the implications for the USA itself, the global politics, and Africa. One might add, and Africa in particular, given that our first panelist, Professor Gilbert Kadiagala, Professor Emeritus in International Relations at FITS, will be our first speaker, followed by Stephen Chan, not a stranger at all to our forum, Professor of World Politics at SOAS, University of London, and then followed by Michelle Gavin, former ambassador and senior fellow for African Studies at the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. And last but not least, Todd Moss, another old friend of ours, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Department in the U.S. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for gracing this occasion. It's most timely that we should be looking at the Trump factor in world politics. Let's start therefore with Gilbert, who will outline the problematic for us and highlight some of the issues as it relates to Africa. The other panelists, of course, will come in as we want them to elaborate, contradict, or place on record their own position on this major factor in international politics. Gilbert.
Thank you, Ibo, for the invitation, and very, very privileged to be on this distinguished panel with people I've met over the years and some that I haven't met. But I'd like to thank you for organizing this event. I think what I'll do is to state from the outset that I'll stay away from Trump's implications of Trump's victory on US domestic politics, because I haven't lived in the US for the last 18 years. So I don't have the authority to speak on that issue. Neither am I actually going to look at global trends. I think the interesting thing is that this may come up in our discussions as we keep going, because I think the other lady and gentlemen are more vast also. So I thought I would just focus largely on what I think are the implications for Trump on Africa, and then I'll end my presentation there. But I wanted to preface my remarks with what I found very intriguing during the US elections, especially from this end of the world. There was a lot of what you describe as popular support for the Trump presidency or candidacy. Particularly among the young people, and this was actually reflected in social media. And I talk to people here, and they keep saying the same thing, that Trump was the strongest candidate and the best candidate. And I think my response to that intriguing phenomena is twofold. One, I think, is what I want to call Africa's fascination with the big man and the strong man. I think Trump was very attractive to the average African voter because of that culture of strongmen, and that's why I thought there was a heavy emphasis on Trump is the best candidate. But the second point, particularly from the South African perspective or Southern Africa perspective, is essentially the issue of xenophobia. I think a lot of the South African supporters of Trump saw it very conveniently as a way, in fact, to drum up the anti-xenophobic, the xenophobic stance of the majority of the South Africans here. We don't want foreigners in our backyard. They should go back home, and that to me reflected in the debates about Trump, particularly his potential. We know his policies on immigrants and foreigners. So I just wanted to put it clearly at the start. But it may impact also what I'm going to call how then is Trump perceived after the election, because that to me is what matters. There is, I think, if we look at the current writings on Africa and the US, there is an emerging consensus that in fact the Trump administration is going to continue the policies that it articulated very clearly from the first day when he was elected the last time. Nothing has changed fundamentally, I think, from Trump's perspective, from Trump's outlook around the world, about the world. And I also suspect there hasn't been any significant shift on his part with regard to Africa. So that is I think, the starting point that I want to articulate here. So what we are going to see, therefore, is a lot of the disdain, a lot of the disinterestedness, a lot of the contemptuousness about Africa that we saw expressed very vividly in the statements that came out of Trump during the first administration. But the second point, which is more a continuous element of US policy, was a focus on Africa as really a non-essential actor in US foreign policy. Africa is not important. As somebody described it, Africa is a backwater in US foreign policy. This is the theme, I think, that is going to undergird the second Trump administration towards Africa. So this is now picking more on the issues around the disdain and contemptuousness about Africa, and therefore nothing has changed. However, the main difference here, as of the last time, the previous years, was what is the Africa team going to look like? And that is still very much a work in progress. You remember the last time, it took almost 2 years for ambassadors to be appointed and to report to their stations, particularly in African countries, even in major countries like South Africa. Again, a continuation of that attitude about Africa. So the team is important, because what the team did the last time is that the ambassadors were actually much more creative in trying to play a much more nicer and kinder role in their stations. In fact, to dampen the kinds of attitudes, the kinds of approaches, and the kinds of noises and voices that were coming out of Africa. Out of Washington. So that team, when it comes into, the faster we have, or the faster there is going to be an African team, I think the more important US foreign policy may have an opportunity of changing. And I see already there is the Secretary of State, Mario Rubio, who has some African experience just by virtue of having visited the Horn of Africa on a trip for the Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee. So some people are pointing to that as, of course, he may probably change the tone or may moderate the tone of Trump too with regard to Africa. But we still have yet to see a more African team that is going to come up and shape that policy. So what are the things that are really going to remain constant? What are the themes that are going to remain the same as from the previous Trump one? And I just want to point out to some of them. I think the focus, if you do the reading, you'll see a lot of discussions on transactionalism. Trump's preference for bilateral relationships with African leaders, and therefore Trump has no stomach for regional or sub-regional institutions dealing with the US. And the bilateralism is going to be accentuated even more during the second administration. The other point I want to put to the table regarding the transactionalism is the issue around there's not going to be any democracy promotion from the US. And we saw that in the very first term when Trump said democracy promotion was not as salient, or at least some of his people said it was not as salient in approaching Africa and the rest of the world. So I don't see that changing very significantly. So it's going to continue. The third element is the military engagements. You remember that in the last few months of his presidency, he was already planning to pull out of US military engagement in the Horn of Africa, particularly in the counterterrorism struggles against Al-Shabaab. I see this continuing because, as I said, I don't really see any significant change in the policy that Trump articulated from the outset. But I also see the continuation because we have some inkling of these very policies that I'm describing in Project 2025, where the US has in fact begun to articulate, or the Trump people began to articulate what could be the future foreign policy. So a lessened military disengagements, and therefore pulling back on issues such as counterterrorism in Africa. The other component that I see continuing is competition with China, but on a very different, a different take. And we saw it very recently with Trump threatening to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS countries. I see it more as a threat than a real policy, but it's an important threat because what it's telling countries who are anticipating to join BRICS is that you are going to do that at your own peril. So the competition with China is going to continue, but it's going to take different forms. The threats and the bluffing here and here on BRICS and so on. But I also don't see real competition with China as we saw it in the previous years, because I see that there is a recognition within the US that there is no need to compete with China if you can't bring the money, if you can't bring the resources on the table. So while there's going to be a rhetorical competition on China, but I don't really see that changing fundamentally, because I think the Chinese story is what I would describe as the train having left the station. The US has not been that engaged, and I don't see Trump, therefore, being as aggressive on that front as he told us in his first term. The other important component, of course, is issues such as AGOA, and there is already discussion on AGOA being a regional trade arrangement between Africa, which is going to have Africa and the US has to be renewed next year. I don't see that happening, and I would imagine that African countries are beginning to probably realize that that may not happen, given that Trump is back in the White House. The other important element, which comes up every other time US-Africa relations, is the foreign assistance. And I recall that the last Trump administration had made some threats on actually abolishing USAID. I don't know whether it will be one of the agencies that gets on the cutting block when Elon Musk comes up with his new cutbacks in the US bureaucracy. So I actually also very skeptical about the continuation of US aid as we know it. And I think given that this was put very clearly in the Project 2025 that this can be scaled down to a very, very small agency. So I think those are the critical elements, I think, that are going to be what I call elements of continuity. Some people are beginning to argue, Trump pulling back from the climate climate commitments of the Biden administration is going to help Africa, because now Africa is going to continue their coal and so on. But I don't really see that as a positive element in terms of the energy transition. I think that's a very dangerous point to make, and I've seen it, and I've shuddered at the point that, you know, Africa can exploit Trump's position on the energy transition so that they can get back into their natural gas and all that. The more important element, as is always the case, is the question about what is Africa's position towards the United States. I'm always concerned that every 4 years, the debate about the US comes up more frequently, but there is no real discussion within Africa about what is Africa's position towards a new US presidency or an all US presidency and so on. I think this should fundamentally be the important building block for Africa's engagement with the US, rather than these perennial worries about who is going to be a man or a woman in the White House. And I'm saying this because the Biden administration's strategy for Africa established what I think is an abiding and enduring policy that should in fact be the backdrop to Africa US policy, which said African countries are allowed to choose their partners if they pay the cost for that kind of choice. So the international partnerships that Africa has are the partnerships that Africa is going to decide, which I think is a more important policy because it speaks to African agency here. What can Africans be doing more towards creating a voice that will be uniform or unified? Because as I said, the Trump administration is not going to be interested in multilateral institutions. It's not going to be interested in the AU. But what are we doing ourselves to make sure that we can strengthen these voices, these institutions, so that they can speak for Africa? I don't see that happening. And that is why I'm saying it's been a very perennial problem in Africa's engagement, not just with the US, but also with China and Russia and other countries. So I don't think there'll be any new breakthroughs in Washington. So Africa needs to get its act together. In fact, in February next year, you're going to have the elections for the AU chair. And the AU is going to have to shape Africa's position towards the rest of the world, since, for instance, now they are part of the G20. But how are those elections therefore going to affect the solidity of Africa's position towards the world? You see, you look at the candidates contesting for the AU chairship, and they leave a lot to be desired. You have a Kenyan who I don't think will be able to get that position because of very many factors, and they have been discussed here and here. The Djibouti candidate, I understand, is the leading candidate, but I don't see how we can have a country as compromised as Djibouti leading the African Union in the era of constructive engagement, if we could put it, with the United States, with Trump and other powers. So we need, within Africa, I think that's my biggest worry, we need to get our act together so that we don't continually worry whether Trump is going to cut foreign aid, whether Trump is going to cut military disengagement, to cut military engagement in Africa and so on, so that we are in a position where we can say our African institutions are solid enough, in fact, to engage whoever comes into the White House, are solid enough to deal with the rest of the world. So let me stop here for now, and then I can let the others.
No, thanks, Gilbert. I think you've given us a beautiful outline. But of course, your note of discord at the end, if it is a fact, which it is, that Africa lacks multilateral unity, continental unity, that its institutions, in particular the AU, is very amorphous, and that we are unlikely to see a strong African position vis-a-vis not only the US but any other factor in global politics. But do you, as a passing shot for now, do you see any significance in the fact, any significance for U.S. South African relations in the fact that Trump has chosen 3 South African billionaires for his administration? Is this significant in any way? Is it anything to do with South Africa specifically, or just with the nature of billionaires as Trump would have them?
No, I don't think it has to do directly with South Africa. I think Elon Musk and the rest are people, I think, that have been very useful to Trump. Domestic, and maybe down the road they'll play a bigger role in foreign policy. But currently, especially the South Africa policy. But I would imagine that currently, I think the bigger sell for these individuals was really their financial clout within the U.S. system. But I think the point you're raising, which is interesting, is how are they going to translate this clout into foreign policy, particularly in very contentious relationship with a country like South Africa, where the US will be watching very carefully what South Africa does from here on. You remember that under the Biden administration, they had a lot of problems with Russia and with China. I would imagine it will be a big escalation if you have people like Elon Musk talking to Trump about South Africa. And I don't see that as a positive element, actually.
That's interesting. I think I'll go to Stephen Chan. Stephen, on that note, what have you got to say? My last question to Gilbert. What are your reflections? Do you see any significance in this appointment of Elon Musk and 2 others, white South African billionaires, who are really on the right-wing fringe, one might say? Do you see any significance, Stephen?
They're certainly on the right-wing fringe. I don't see any significance in their having some South African background. I think Gilbert's completely correct that they're there because they've been useful to Donald Trump within the US context. And they're likely to be very influential people, particularly someone like Elon Musk. He has a lot of firepower, he has a lot of reserves, he has a lot of influence and persuasive influence at that on Donald Trump. So it's going to be an interesting administration. A lot of the people have had very little governmental experience. So they'll be feeling their way forward, and there'll be many mistakes made simply because of clumsiness and inexperience. These mistakes will cost other countries, of course. But
yes, sorry, Steve, now you can come in with your own substantive.
No, thank you.
One of the things is, of course, is the relations across the Atlantic.
I would agree with that, certainly. But I was much taken by Gilbert's concluding comments that Africa has got to find a voice, some kind of unity to talk back to the world and to talk back to Trump. There's no signs of that right now, whereas in the Middle East, there are signs of some kind of very loose alliances being formed, even among countries that were normally mortal enemies, basically to resist what they think will be Trump's policies towards the Middle East. So Africa's got to be able to initiate some diplomacy within itself precisely to do that kind of speaking back in a unified way. Now, I was in Washington, D.C. just 2 weeks before the election, and even my senior Republican friends didn't think the Trump victory would be so sweeping and so decisive. In fact, they weren't certain he was going to win at all. And even 2 days before the election itself, one of them came to visit me in London, and he was still then uncertain it would be a Trump victory. That was decisive, took everyone by surprise. They're very happy about it, of course. And Trump can say he has a mandate and he's going to exploit that mandate. So he feels empowered now. It is going to have consequences for the world. Say a few things about Africa in the first instance, precisely as it relates to the administration under Trump. Although the cabinet itself is notwithstanding the odd trip to Africa here and there, notwithstanding some kind of millionaire background in South Africa, the cabinet itself is largely not grounded in Africa, no real deep, abiding Africa interest, no interest at all, in fact, in many countries outside of the United States. But what I detected in Washington was a furious lobbying for the positions just underneath the cabinet positions. In other words, everyone knows that Rubio is likely now to be Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, as it were, for the United States. But there's a fierce lobbying right now for who's going to be the Undersecretary, who's going to be the Deputy Secretary, et cetera, et cetera. Now, traditionally, the highest office of the State Department for Africa is the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. There's a fair push that they might want to elevate responsibility for Africa up to Undersecretary level. And this is a serious endeavor on the part of people with real Africa experience. Now, the big question is, are they going to succeed in doing that? And B, if they do succeed, what kind of influence will they have on Rubio in the first instance? And what influence will they have on Trump? I think very, very much, very little real influence, but some moderation, at least, of the rhetoric that might come out of the White House. That's probably the best that we can hope for. But I really do have fears that USAID is going to be cut back. I really do have fears that AGOA, the trade treaty, is going to suffer. This will have direct consequences for Zimbabwe, of course, in terms of aid being cut back. Your whole progress in terms of combating HIV/AIDS, for instance, has largely been because of quite generous USAID subventions to the health sector in Zimbabwe. So if that gets cut back, you've got major, as it were, resurgence of a pandemic, which is a very, very deadly one with great social consequences. That kind of thing is likely to be replicated throughout Africa. Cutbacks, they're quite harmful. And kind of cutting back on AGOA will be part of a global strategy, which is basically Trump weaponizing tariffs. He's going to do this against China. He's threatened to do this against his neighbors, Canada and Mexico. They're in almost emergency conclave now as to what to do about that. A tariff war with China is something that the Chinese do not want, but they are making preparations for what they would do in a tariff war. A tariff war that could get very, very brutal. The Chinese are quite alarmed, for instance, about the banning of TikTok in the United States. If they can ban something like that, what else will they be able to ban? So all kinds of things are at stake. And notwithstanding the fact that the Chinese have got considerable leverage in the US economy, they bought up a lot of toxic debt during the banking crisis, for instance. So they have got leverage, but whether they'll be able to employ that leverage, whether they can deploy it, is another question entirely. And what you've got is a very great Chinese sense of not losing face. If Trump comes across as some kind of strong man, it's very much in the interests of Chinese pride and also in the interests of President Xi Jinping to also be a hard man, a big man. It could have some kind of diplomatic equivalent of a clash of titans at the top of world diplomacy. But what you're going to have at the lower levels of world diplomacy, I think, are quite disastrous things for countries that have been struggling. The Trump policy on Ukraine is almost certainly going to result in Ukraine having to concede a lot of territory. In other words, although they'll have some kind of security vouchsafed as part of a deal, what they've been fighting for will be to a substantial extent lost to the Russians. And that sends a signal about territorial integrity, about sovereign integrity, about being able to be an independent country, about not being recolonized. I use that term very advisedly because the Ukrainians see this as an effort on the part of Russia to recolonize them, something that Africa resists. Now, the Ukrainians are going to get it in the neck, and I think that's probably going to be the case. And Zelensky has already been making statements about how they're going to try to cope with that, how they're going to accommodate that. If they're going to get it in the neck, the Palestinians will get it in the neck even more. They'll be driven into a tiny series of enclaves. All of the militant opposition to Israel, like Hamas, will have been destroyed, effectively not able to be reassembled. Gaza will be rebuilt on Israeli terms with a continuing presence there. There's already been a victory by default in the northern part of the Middle Eastern theater with the change of government in Syria that no one actually predicted. That basically puts a very great deal of difficulty in the path of Hezbollah, for instance. So one way or the other, US policy in support of Israel and the Israeli policies, both north and south of Israel itself, is being accommodated by events. It's going to be further accommodated by Donald Trump. He will basically do what Netanyahu wants him to do, with all kinds of promises of safeguarding this or safeguarding that, but he'll be dealing with a corrupt Palestinian Authority. They're not going to stand in the way of essentially a permanent expansionism of Israeli interests. How much territory that will involve, that's another question that will have to be asked in due course. So there are all kinds of questions from Africa, from the Middle East, from China. There are all kinds of questions as well from Europe. The NATO ministers of defense and the NATO ministers of finance have been meeting in emergency conclave. Can we raise our defense spending to 3% so that we won't face these demands that we faced last time from Trump, we've got to pull our weight? Can we get in before him and say, look, we're about to pull our weight, we've raised our defense spending. But what this means is that you're raising your defense spending, against whom are you preparing to defend yourself? This suggests an increasing tension between Europe, between the West, and possibly between the United States and President Putin in Russia. A real danger to world peace there, a real danger to world stability, a real danger to any kind of balance of power, in the old-fashioned term, emerging in the European theater. So the world is going to be on edge in almost every single area that you can think about. Trade, weaponization of tariffs, the confrontation between the two great superpowers, China and the United States, the cutting of close links or trustworthy links between traditional Western allies like the US and Europe, all kinds of divisions, and basically, I think Gilbert was right. There's not going to be too much concentrated, devoted, serious interest in Africa. Those who've got an African interest may well fight for Africa's corner within the US administration. I myself hope that they do. I don't think they're going to be as effective as they would like to be in their most wishful dreaming. So all of us outside of America basically face the prospect under Trump of America becoming, or trying to become, the world hegemon, a unipolar power bestriding the entire world. Africa has no look into this. Other parts of the world be marginalized in this. Trump wants America first, but Trump also wants America to be the greatest. There's going to be a very, very interesting ride. How will other countries react to what's essentially a complete change in the world order, where there was previously some kind of pluralism? And you can forget about the United Nations being a force. You can forget about any respect for the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. There'll be probably some kinds of revenge from Israel against South Africa for taking action in these international tribunals with Trump's blessing. So key African countries are vulnerable to a foreign policy of revenge. There will certainly be a domestic policy of revenge in terms of how Trump tries to run the United States. But this kind of spreading out of antagonism, this kind of spreading out of bitterness is likely to be a feature, I regret, of the Trump administration in global relations. So that's my very, very pessimistic view. So I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but I really can't think of any other way to express it. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Very fascinating stuff from you. But do you think that inadvertently, at least, that under Trump, the U.S. will cease more and more to be the hegemon that it has been in the last decades?
I think it's going to want to be an even greater hegemon, and one which is more bellicose, not necessarily just in military action, but weaponizing economic strength, for instance, as I say, the tariff wars. With most countries, America is going to win those tariff wars, although it's going to be very, very costly, of course, even for America. But people can't fight back beyond a certain point. So basically, economically, certainly, militarily, Trump is not going to deploy the US military in theaters outside of America. He wants to be a US president, one of the first US presidents in recent times not to be at war with other countries. However, that's not to say he can't use proxy powers. So the key thing to look for is to what extent will he allow Israel to act as a military proxy for United States interests against surrounding countries. He doesn't need to do that very much in Syria right now, although watching brief has to be kept on that. We don't really know the shape or the intentions of the new government. The people now who are probably making all kinds of contingency plans are the Iranians. Now, there was a lot of discussion about this just a week ago at the Doha Forum in Qatar. This is the annual diplomatic love fest, sort of like the diplomatic version of Davos, in which many, many important things are discussed, usually behind closed doors. The hotel where they hold this conference, apart from having superb conference facilities, has got a maze of tunnels linking certain key rooms, which facilitates private diplomacy. No one ever sees you going to see anyone else that you're not meant in public to see. And so a lot of diplomacy takes place, and a lot of this would have been transactional. What's the deal? Transactional diplomacy under Trump is going to increase. If we do this for you, you've got to do this for us. And that kind of asking price is not going to be, as it were, very welcome in many of the deals that Trump might propose. It's definitely going to be like a real estate super salesman trying to run the world. So very much, as it were, we're going to have to sit down.
On that note, Stephen, don't you think that the Trump's relationship with the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia, for example, even Qatar, a major factor in at least restraining or getting Trump to restrain Israel in its madness vis-a-vis the Gaza and even vis-a-vis Iran?
Look, they don't want him to go to war with Iran. They'd much rather have some kind of peaceful, even if uneasy, coexistence with Iran. They feel that Iran has been neutered to a certain extent in any case because of the victory of forces that did not ally itself with in Syria, and the neutering of Hezbollah. I know the people in Qatar very, very well. I've worked with them in the past. They're completely demoralized after trying so hard to broker a peace deal in Gaza, for instance. So to a certain extent, they've run out of steam to try to object to whatever Trump might propose, which I think might well be some kind of rerun of what he proposed the first time around. And that is essentially what we would all recognize as a Middle East version of the South African Bantustans. That's going to be the Palestinian state, a necklace of so-called free cities. This will be a disaster for sovereign expectations and aspirations of the Palestinian people. And Gaza will become a colony. The Israelis are not going to get out of that after having done so much work to basically overcome it, destroy Hamas in the process. Now, all of this has cost the Israelis an awful lot of money. How a small country can be militarized so actively on so many fronts has already, to this extent, depended on American help, economic, financial help. Now, that's going to continue. So my fear is that in the Middle East, America won't go to war, but it will weaponize, it will equip, and it will give us permissions to its allies, such as Israel, to wage war on its behalf.
That's interesting. Last question to you, Steve. What of the U.S.-British relations, and And also, maybe I said last question, but one fascinating question. What do you make of the relationship between Trump and Putin?
The two men, to a certain extent, admire each other, but don't actually understand each other. So there's been a certain wariness there. Trump has got to treat Putin with respect because he has got throwaway to the military nature himself. He's demonstrated that at great cost in Ukraine, for instance. And he's shown great determination to advance Russian interests in an old-fashioned colonial or re-colonial sense. In other words, Putin comes across, as he did in the first Trump administration, as a strong man. This is something that Trump says he admires. And Putin is a strong man. As for Britain, well, I think we're scrambling here now for some kind of diplomatic way to engage with Trump. We've got a left-wing foreign secretary. In fact, he's a SOAS graduate, and he's been making all the right say that. He's making all the right noises in a whole number of international fronts. But in terms of how you're going to develop a pragmatism and a genuine policy of some kind of cooperation in which you don't have to swallow your principles too hard with Trump, they're still working on that. So the foreign secretary, the prime minister, all of these people are hard at work. Now, they have a restraining factor in that the chancellor, the minister of finance, Rachel Reeves, the last thing she wants is more expenditure because she's very, very anxious to make the budget balance, causing great harm to traditional Labour Party constituents. So there's going to be an anchor in terms of what Britain can do. So my feeling is that we'll do nothing. We're not part of Europe. We're not going to be part of a European consensus. We're going to sit back, make all kinds of noises about principle, not try to in any way enforce principle. Basically, the Trump administration will be a revelation of how weak Britain has become as a world player.
Thanks, Stephen. Michelle, welcome, Michelle. We're beginning to get worried when we had no sight of you, but thank you for coming on board. My first question, of course, Michelle, my first question to you, of course, is why and how did Trump win?
Well, there will be many books written on that subject. I think, the short answer is Americans were dissatisfied with the state of the economy, and so were unlikely to resist a change election, even if the change was to a former president, right? So the headwinds for incumbents have been very, very strong. And while Kamala Harris tried to run a campaign that presented her as a fresh new choice, she was President Biden's vice president, and it read like continuity, I think, to a lot of Americans. So I think more than anything else, that's what it was about. But I also think it's important, Gilbert made some excellent points, but just not to overstate what happened in the American election. There was a lot of hyperbole about the Trump victory, which was unquestionably decisive. But he did not win a majority of the popular vote, it turns out, as the final votes were counted. And he won fewer votes in the Electoral College than President Obama did in either of his elections. So the idea that this is kind of a sweeping mandate is not really so accurate.
But what about the issue of race and gender? To what extent do those factors impact on the electoral process, on the election outcome?
I don't want to believe that Americans would never vote for a woman for president. I think it's harder. We know that Americans are willing to vote for a non-white president because they've done it twice. So I don't chalk it up to identity politics, I think is much more prosaic. It's about families struggling with inflation and with a big structural problem that's, finally coming due for America, which is, that our economy now works in such a way, and socioeconomic mobility now work in such a way that you cannot have confidence that your children will be better off than you were, which has been kind of part of the social contract here for quite some time. And so people feel like the game is rigged in favor of elites. It becomes very easy to scapegoat different elements of society who are taking what's yours. And so, yes, did the Trump campaign kind of use a lot of language about others, the out group, to explain why people are dissatisfied? I think so, but I don't necessarily think that the way people feel about race and gender sort of not connected to their economic dissatisfaction was responsible for where we landed.
Okay, we'll come back to that when we talk to Todd and the others on this platform. But what then broadly are the implications for the US of this Trump victory? In your view, what?
Well, I think we're in for some significant economic turmoil, given the president-elect's enthusiasm around tariffs and apparent misunderstanding about how they work, and what the implications are for consumers in this country. We'll see. We'll see. There's always so much hyperbole with Donald Trump, and it's hard sometimes to separate the showmanship from what's actually going to be executed. So, because I'm a foreign policy person, it's easier for me to talk about that. And what I can say is that I agree that our policy will be transactional in nature in most instances, that it will be bilateral, that personal relationships will count for a lot, that there will be disdain for multilateral institutions. But I do want to just kind of flag that, particularly in regions like Africa, where the senior-most members of the Trump administration aren't all that interested or engaged, Congress can continue to play a huge role, and they did in the first Trump administration. Trump would send budget requests to Congress that dramatically slashed foreign assistance, and what ultimately was appropriated would plus it back up. So, the U.S. political system is complex, and even with Republican majorities in the Congress, individual members can get things done. There remains a constituency that cares about foreign assistance and cares about Africa. And if the executive branch is sort of pursuing a policy of more or less neglect, that congressional interest can become much more significant and prominent. So it's an important part of the picture.
Yeah, any comments on what Gilbert had to say with respect to Africa? I don't know, were you in the conversation there at that time?
I was, and I listened, and I think he was right about multilateralism, that the administration is likely to have very little time for it, very little respect for it. So the idea of kind of a unified African position on engagement with the U.S., I think there's a chance we're going to end up talking past each other, because the Trump administration will be pursuing these bilateral transactional deals. I think there's a good chance that in areas in the Horn, the administration will be happy to defer to some Gulf partners who are much more interested than the U.S. is, but that will have its limits since some of those partners are actually at loggerheads in the region. I think Gilbert was right about competition with China becoming a major kind of animating force to explain the whys of where the administration will pursue these kinds of transactional relationships. And the other piece I'd add on Africa that I'm quite concerned about is the administration's continued sort of denialism around climate change and dismissiveness around both reducing carbon emissions, but more relevant for Africa, the responsibility of big emitters to help with adaptation and building resilience. This concerns me greatly.
But in the same way that you indicated or implied that Congress has a role to play in either mediating, modifying, or even challenging Trump's policies domestically and internationally. Gilbert made the point that much of what happens with respect to possible U.S. policy on Africa during the Trump era would depend on the African team. Any indications as to who might emerge as the African team? You won't be one of them.
I will. No, this is not my crowd. But I don't pretend to have special insight. There are always rumors that fly around, but I am not the right person for inside baseball on the Trump team.
No hints at all.
We'll see if Todd knows more.
Yeah. Then the last act in Africa by Biden, the Lobito corridor. What's your understanding of that? It's being flagged here as the vain attempt by the U.S. to counter China influence. But when you look at the geography of it, it's hard to see where the competition comes in. Are there any other sort of underlying factors behind the Lobito corridor?
I mean, I think the Lobito corridor sort of initiative is responsive to a number of things. So it's not just the competition with China, right, but a recognition that that the biggest challenge facing most African governments is job creation. That to begin to get at that, you have to acknowledge that you need the infrastructure that allows for value addition and job creation, and it also speaks to the interest in access to critical minerals for a green transition. So it hits kind of multiple priorities, I would say, at once.
Yeah, but then why isn't that consistent with the AGOA? And why would Trump meddle with AGOA at all? Since basically AGOA has always been a foreign relations, public relations affair. It's not something that's essential to the American economy. AGOA.
No, it's not essential to the American economy. AGOA provides duty-free access for African goods to our market, not the other way around. So AGOA, the ball is in Congress's court right now on AGOA. If there is a clear congressional majority in support of renewal, I don't see why the Trump White House would pick that particular fight. It just doesn't matter to them enough. So I don't necessarily think that that it's hopeless on AGOA. I think the jury is very much still out.
Yes. And then, of course, the factors flagged by both by Stephen in particular were the hot spots of the world, mainly Ukraine, the Middle East, and of course the Israeli Gaza situation, and of course NATO, relationship with NATO. What are your comments on those three areas with respect to what might happen under the Trump regime?
Yeah, I definitely share the concern for Ukraine that the Trump administration will be much less solicitous of kind of Ukrainian red lines and priorities in attempting to broker some kind of peace. And I, share the concerns about the consequences, right, in terms of the message sent around territorial aggression, and this notion that big powers can, be back in the business of invading and annexing their neighbors. This is not good news for any of us. I think, when it comes to NATO, it's going to be, very much the same message, pay up, or don't expect our security blanket. And for me, what I really worry about on multiple fronts is this question of U.S. credibility and the degree to which countries, certainly in alliance with us, but in general, where we find common interests and move out together with other countries, how much confidence do our partners have that we're going to keep our word? And so this worries me a tremendous amount, just because there's so many kind of fundamental disagreements now that can be made manifest as we shift power, whereas before we did have a broad American consensus on a number of kind of core principles and points. And as that erodes, I do think it makes it harder to count on us over time on multiple fronts. As for the Middle East, it's very difficult for me to see how this change of administration will in any way respond to the existing concerns and criticisms, both internationally and domestically, around U.S. policy and what's happening in Gaza. Obviously, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have a complicated relationship. But I think at the end of the day, they're both pretty transactional individuals. And I have nothing terribly hopeful to say on that front.
So we have a lot of despair about the Middle East.
Indeed.
Will this carnage continue unabated? Is there nothing in the U.S. Public opinion architecture that can bring to bear and get Americans as a whole to understand that this carnage cannot continue against the Palestinian people?
I mean, there is actually a great deal of discussion and debate in American society about this issue. It's not one that people aren't talking about. It's not one that they're not demonstrating around. I just don't know that the Trump administration would be particularly responsive on this issue.
No, thanks, Michelle. Okay, I'll get back to you. Todd, are you around? Hi, Todd.
Hi, Ibo. Nice to see you.
Yes. Maybe you can now sum up for us the Trump victory of implications for the U.S. itself, global dynamics, and Africa.
Okay, so
maybe I should begin by asking you also the same question I asked Michelle. Why and how did Trump win?
I think Michelle basically nailed it, that there's a lot of anxiety about the economy. And in particular, among the working classes, which had traditionally been supporters of the Democratic Party. They've now moved over to the Republican Party. So there's a very deep split in the United States electorate between those that have a college education and those that do not. And they're moving in different directions. And we're also seeing a very geographic split where effectively people in the coasts are better educated and much more democratic, and everyone in the middle is moving more Republican. And we're seeing some self-sorting. So people abortion is a good example. If you're a very, very strong supporter of reproductive rights, you're not going to want to live in the South or in one of these states that's very strictly anti-abortion. And so we are seeing people start to move and migrate within the country to places where people think more like themselves, which is actually, I think, quite a worrying trend for American democracy. But I would also just repeat Michelle's basic point that this was, while it was a surprise, it was not an emphatic victory. Trump lost by more than 4 points in 2020, and he came back. And so I think we shouldn't overread what's really quite a small movement in the electorate. So we will have to see. But it's also part of a global movement where incumbents are losing everywhere. We just saw this, in Ghana, and again, inflation and economic issues were at center stage. So that's my best explanation about what happened in the U.S. election. I don't know. Do you want to? I'd love to jump right to U.S.-Africa relations and maybe respond to Gilbert's excellent.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Tony.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So I think these webinars are much more interesting if people don't agree with each other all the time. So I have one big agreement with Gilbert and 3 disagreements. So the big agreement is that we don't really know what's going to happen, because Africa is not going to be a priority. Clearly, the Trump administration is going to be focused on Israel. They want to be harder, or show to be harder, on China and Iran. They obviously want to try to push for some kind of peace in Ukraine. And that really doesn't leave much for Africa. I just don't see it as being a big issue, which means he's right that personnel will be influencing policy a lot. And that's why I'd say that my 3 disagreements with him is he was pretty emphatic that there'll be no democracy promotion, there'll be no counterterrorism effort, and that AGOA will fail. I don't think any of those 3 are correct. On democracy promotion, the one personnel person we do know is Marco Rubio, will very likely be Secretary of State. His family fled Cuba, and he has a very strong track record of being pro-democracy and of being a hardliner against autocracies. That's mostly in Latin America, but I would expect him to have an influence, including on democracy promotion in Africa. The second, on counterterrorism, we also know that President Trump's national security advisor will be Mike Walls, who's a former Green Beret who served in Africa, in Afghanistan and a number of places. But they're going to bring a very strong military perspective to a lot of their decisions. And I do not see them walking away from counterterrorism efforts. I think it will be different, especially given the U.S. failures in the Sahel on counterterrorism efforts. But I don't think they're going to be walking away from it. And then last, on AGOA, again, Michelle is 100% right that this is going to be Congress. This is a congressional call. I don't think that the White House is going to care very much one way or the other. They might make a little bit of noise, but this is going to be Congress's call. And I think Congress in general is going to become very, very important. And this, for Zimbabwe in particular, I think that will matter because Zadera is driven by Congress. And the one thing I would just flag for Zimbabweans to watch for is there are a lot of people swirling around the White House, selling what they're claiming is access to the president and to people around him. there's a lot of influence peddling that will be sold in different African capitals, and most of it is a complete scam. So I do think the Zimbabwean government is extremely vulnerable to being scammed, that they will pay somebody money who will end sanctions through the White House, and almost certainly that will not happen. So when you hear about some of these contracts, I would be highly skeptical.
Carry on. The overall implications for the U.S. itself, the global situation.
Yeah.
With regard to the hotspots, the same ask of Michelle. Well, of course, the whole world is worried about the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
And of course, the Middle East. These are the two major areas that we're concerned about. I think you have clarified the issue on Africa. We're glad to hear that, what you had to say. And so there won't be a sea change, so to speak, on foreign policy in Africa. But certainly, people will be concerned about the Middle East. And we hope that what has been said so far with respect to Israel's role in the Middle East will not be true, that there will be some kind of restraining factor to bring peace to the Palestinians. But of course, there's a lot of anxiety also about Ukraine. The meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Macron the other day sort of rang bells that maybe the war is coming to an end soon. What do you say to that, Todd?
Yeah, so the short answer is I don't know. The optimistic view is that bluster from the White House and from the Trump administration can be used as leverage in getting to a deal. I could see that happening both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, but I could also see that going very, very badly, and we could see the opposite effect. So, Trump clearly wants to be seen as an uncritical supporter of Israel. That could push parties to come to some deal, but it could also unleash the worst demons on both sides. So how that's going to play out, I think, is going to be quietly decided in the negotiating room. And so I just don't know. I try to hang on to a little bit of optimism that we could get there, but I'd say I think the chances of something going very badly are quite high. The other issue I would say is that there's a lot of talk, particularly from the new vice president, J.D. Vance, that we're just not going to get involved in a lot of foreign policy issues. I think every incoming administration thinks they're going to focus on domestic issues and they'll be able to ignore foreign policy. And then reality quickly slaps them in the face and they have to pivot into a much more aggressive foreign policy. I mean, Syria already is going to force itself on this new administration, and they're not going to be able to walk away. So I think global events will, can scupper the best intentions.
But do you think that the question I asked earlier on, do you have any idea as to what the Africa team would look like?
Yeah, I don't know. I've heard some of the same names that I'm sure Michelle has heard swirling around. I would guess it hasn't been determined. And before you ask, no, I'm definitely not going into this administration. I did work for President Bush. But if you think of the Bush administration, they were very aggressively pro-democracy. They embraced foreign aid, perhaps as much as any administration. They were very pro-immigration, and they were free traders. So this is a very different Republican administration than the Bush administration and some of the officials that I worked with. So I wouldn't expect that crowd to come back at all.
The last question to you right now is, do you see any significance in the fact that Trump has appointed in his team 3 white South African billionaires? Is there any significance for South Africa? in particular?
I think the big significance is that somebody who is supposed to be a man of the people and is running on helping the little guy likes to surround himself with billionaires. So I think there's going to be a real disconnect between some of the rhetoric and what the kinds of policies they're going to make. And we can look, at U.S. tax policy, I think will be a very important signal there as well.
But Stephen said something to the effect that South Africa might be in for punishment from Trump for its role, the ICJ, for example. Is there a possibility, therefore, that people like Elon Musk might be people with such influence to push Trump more and more towards that direction?
Well, I think that's much more of an issue on policy towards Israel than on anything to do with South Africa. I do think South Africa is going to have to work hard to build a positive relationship with this team, but I don't think it's gonna. I don't think it's fundamentally insurmountable.
Okay, thanks, Todd. We'll come back to you, Gilbert. Any comments on the subsequent speakers this evening?
No, I just Todd, thank you again for those criticisms. But I think my reaction is that the importance of a strong U.S. team on Africa, a strong U.S. constituency on Africa, and even the issue around ambassadors, to me is more important. And I think I made it clear that in the context where you have a president totally disengaged from an issue such as Africa, for instance, the stronger team you have that may have those kinds of inclinations is important. And so I'm glad that you mentioned Marco Rubio in the democracy horizon. So that's good news, I think, for most people in Africa now who are worried that it's really just going to be a repeat of the first administration, but where they were tempered by, I think, as I said, a team that had some interest in these issues, ambassadors who could stand there on ground. So I agree that it's actually, I may be overplaying the issue. But I also wanted to make a bigger point, which is democracy promotion generally is in trouble. I think even under the Biden administration, or under most US administrations, you have to really put a lot of money in it to make traction. And I'm just thinking about countries like Kenya, for instance. How much democracy promotion can you do to change the mindsets there? We know, for instance, the US government has poured quite a lot of money, even in institutions like the Electoral Commission. But every time these are dysfunctional institutions, they can't run elections. We see that happening every other year. And so I'm saying that the institutions of democracy promotion that the US has been, in fact, pumping a lot of money in don't actually seem to work. And that is the point I want to make, that the entire enterprise actually is not working as we expected it would work. That there will be a consensus on this side about the significance of democracy. And then these countries that actually have some measure of commitment to democracy would go to the US or to these Western partners and ask for resources, in fact, to make a change in the electoral processes and so on. But it's not happening. So that's my bigger skepticism about probably if it's re-engineered, if democracy promotion is re-engineered to give more of these actors more room to do the kinds of things that the US is asking or the West is asking them to do, it will be probably a fundamental shift rather than just pouring money into institutions that are essentially dysfunctional. On the issue of AGOA, again, I agree. And I probably, hopefully that Congress would have that voice and the leadership that Michelle is talking about. So because that's also a bigger worry from this end, that in fact, probably because of a lack of understanding of how the US process works, the people are jumping to the conclusion that AGOA is in trouble and that Trump will go back to the Kenya kind of bilateral arrangement on some free trade area, and that is going to be the wave of the future. So it's good to learn that, in fact, there is a constituency for AGOA in Congress. Again, the counterterrorism, if there are individuals within the administration who can then, in fact, champion that cause, because it's still a problem across the Sahel, across the Horn of Africa. But I was just picking up on Trump's earlier inclination to say, what should the American military be doing in far-flung places like the Horn of Africa? So if there's somebody who can bring him to order, then I think it may be good news for even countries like Somalia that still have to battle with that issue. Let me stop here for now.
Okay, I'll come back just for you to sum up at the end, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I'll go to Stephen. I'm glad Stephen is still with us. Stephen, your last word for tonight? Stephen, you're muted, I think. Stephen? Stephen? Hi, Stephen. Can you hear me? We can't hear you, Stephen. David, can you help? Stephen?
You? Here we are.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay. No, I mean, it's been a very, very good panel, and I've really enjoyed the exchange of views. And of course, our US colleagues are completely correct. You've got a congressional influence on the future of institutions like AGOA. It's not a case of whether or not we on the outside know the role of Congress. It's very much a case of whether or not there are sufficient people in Congress who understand Africa. And in my visits to Washington, I'm not exactly optimistic that there's much comprehensive weight in Congress with an interest and particularly some kind of care and concern for Africa. And there's a great deal of ignorance which is translated from the American sort of middle states into Congress itself. They are, after all, the representatives of the people from exactly these areas that don't have an interest in the world at large. So every time I go to the US, I'm just struck by the complete ignorance of anything African, even in very sophisticated cities, let alone in, let us say, some of the more Midwestern cities. So I hope Congress preserves AGOA. It's quite right to say that America's got nothing to gain or lose in this particular case, so might as well just keep it. But if there's a general, and my point was, if there's a general tone initiated by the executive, by Trump, of the tariff war in general, weaponizing tariffs, weaponizing trade as an instrument of foreign policy, what I'm concerned about is whether or not there'll be sufficient people in Congress who will just come in behind this overall policy of weaponizing trade, weaponizing tariffs, weaponizing a negative attitude towards trade agreements like AGOA. I don't think there are many Congress people that I know anyway, who understand just how much advantage a treaty like AGOA brings to key African countries, how much it helps and encourages industrialization, for instance. So this kind of overall ignorance, not just towards Africa, the point I was making was that there's a huge amount still of ignorance in the Congress and in America at large towards the wider world. It's always, for me, a very, very depressing experience every time I go to America. And I was there most recently, as I said, shortly before the elections on a lecture tour. Some of the questions I was asked on my lecture tour were so depressing that you want to leave the United States of America in a suicidal mode. So I'm not totally certain that Congress will see sense and basically roll forward the goal.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for coming on this platform today. I'm sure we'll call you on here again. Michelle, your last word? Michelle? Can't hear you, Michelle.
How about now?
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
So I would just say that the United States of America contains multitudes. There are members of Congress who are quite knowledgeable about Africa. They don't always come from where you would expect. I worked on Capitol Hill for many years for a senator from Wisconsin in the heartland who made it a point to become extremely knowledgeable and aware about Africa. So it's very hard to generalize. And I think that Todd Moss was absolutely right that we really don't know what's going to unfold in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I certainly learned from the first Trump administration is that looking for kind of consistency is a mistake. Because they're opportunistic, right? So they kind of, if you can get kind of a grab bag, magpie-like approach to the world that has all kinds of internal contradictions, but also means that maybe there are some interesting opportunities or possibilities. So I don't think we need to be suicidally depressed.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Todd, your last word? Todd, can't hear you. Todd? Todd? David, can you help? Todd? Frozen. Okay, well, Gilbert, are you ready? Gilbert? David? Oh, we have a problem. Huh? Neither Gilbert nor Todd can't hear you.
They're in the backstage area. Someone just needs to add them.
Todd? Gilbert? What could be the problem? David? David. Well, I think on this note, I think we have to call it a day and thank my panelists for this interesting discussion. Just to also remind our viewers that we are also on YouTube, and you can revisit this discussion at your convenience in the days ahead. But thank you very much to you all for joining us. That is Gilbert Gadiagala, Stephen Chen, Michelle Gavin, and Todd Moss. Thank you very much. David, music. David. Goodbye, everybody. It's too late, David. Bye-bye.